All right. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to read this article, Body Ritual Among the Nacerima. And I call it Nacerima. Some people say Nacerima, don't get confused. And you've also had a chance to watch the short YouTube video, Who Are the Nacerima? And by now, you should know who the Nacerima are because there's a big reveal in the end of the film, and you get to see all of the students' surprise. By the way, in your discussion posts that I'm going to have you do later, I'd like to know when it was that you realized who the Nacerima were. Were you reading the article and you figured it out, or was it when you were watching the video, or how long did it take you to figure out who the Nacerima really were? So we're going to have a discussion about the Nacerima, but I just wanted to talk with you a little bit because this is usually something we would do in class, and we'd have a discussion about this, and it's one of the more entertaining portions of the course. But who was Nottingnisha? Well, that's Washington. Just like the Nacerima are actually Americans, this whole story is just kind of a spoof and showing you that if you looked at American culture from a lens of the outsider, American culture could actually look very strange. And remember that this book, or I'm sorry, this article was written in the 1950s, but a lot of these things still kind of hold up true. But just like the Nacerima are American spelled backward, Nottingnassau, or however you want to pronounce that, is actually Washington, George Washington spelled backward. And I'd ask everybody, what is the household shrine with the charm box built into the wall? Well, the answer is that's the medicine cabinet. So what he's talking about is the American obsession with the medicine cabinet and makeup and hair removal and toothpaste and all of these things that we generally associate with simple cleanliness or something hygiene, but are really actually quite strange to most cultures that exist around the world or have existed throughout the world. So who are the medicine men, and what is Latipso? Latipso. Well, the Latipso is hospital, but with deleted the H and put an L in its place, and it's backwards, Latipso. And the medicine men are doctors. You have to give them special wampum, special paper trinkets, which is money, in order to see them. The holy mouth men and the mouth right is simply the dentist and going to get your teeth cleaned. And the ritual, this is the hardest one for students to be able to guess. But what is the ritual of ablution of the mouth for children, which is supposed to improve their moral fiber? Anybody catch that one? The answer is that's washing a child's mouth out with soap when they speak a bad word. When they say a naughty word, the parents used to wash their mouth out with soap as a punishment. So it's the ritual of ablution, which just means cleaning of the mouth for children who is supposed to improve their moral character. So who are the women who bake their heads in ovens? These are women that are at a salon, and they have that big, I don't even know what to call it, somebody help me out, one of those big domes that go over their head and blows the hot air. And who is the listener? The listener is simply a psychologist. So what's the point? Why did I make you read this kind of silly article which talked about American culture but didn't really talk about American culture? Well, one of the things that anthropology does is try to, again, break down barriers between people, between who we call us and who we call them. And so while the purpose of studying another culture is to make that culture, which may seem strange at first, familiar to you, that also should make your culture kind of strange to you. You should learn how your own culture might look to other people. So one of the sort of slogans of anthropology is making the strange familiar and also the familiar strange. So when you go abroad, and some of you students who have spent time abroad or spent significant times in other countries, nations, you might have noticed that when you come back to your own culture, not only do you have culture shock when you go someplace, but you also end up with culture shock when you come back to your own country. So Horace Minor, the author of this article, uses something called exoticization. So he says something that we do every day in a very exotic way. He describes it in this exotic way in order to make it feel very, very strange to us. The holy mouth man poking your gums with sharp objects and this rite that you have to go through. This is what going to the dentist might look like to somebody from another culture, somebody who's never been to a dentist before. They might be horrified to see some strange man put a drill, or strange woman, excuse me, strange person put a drill into your teeth and go to town, and then you say thank you and give them money at the end. So the major takeaway lessons for this reading for me, and why I wanted to read it, is that we often take our own culture for granted, and we are blind to many of its rituals and habits that we don't necessarily recognize the strangeness of. We use our own culture that we grew up with and have lived in our entire life as a standard by which everything else just becomes other culture. My culture is the standard culture, and everybody else has other cultures, exotic cultures. But culture is complex, and we should be skeptical of knowing or judging another culture on one source, right? So there's some elements of truth to the way that Horace Minor describes American culture. We may not have realized it, but actually we do have kind of this weird obsession with beauty and kind of this horrific fear of aging and getting old and making sure that we always look our best. There is this culture of constantly having to buy various products to make sure that we are fitting in and making sure that we look the right part and that we clean our teeth. You know, if you don't clean your teeth, if you don't go to the holy mouth, man, your friends will desert you and your lovers will leave you, right? So if you don't go to the dentist, you'll get bad teeth and nobody will like you anymore. We hear that message every day in advertising and commercials, which we'll talk about later. And we can avoid assumptions by looking for connections between cultures, consulting multiple sources and points of view, and recognizing that bias always exists, right? And this also brings up this thing that I'm going to call emic and edict perspectives. It's not just me calling it, everybody calls it this. Emic and edict type perspective. So there are two types of field research where emic is done from within the social group, and edict is done from outside the social group. So the emic approach investigates how local people think, how they perceive and categorize the world, their rules for behavior, and what has meaning for them, and how they imagine and explain things. While the edict perspective, the scientific-oriented perspective, the outsider perspective, this approach shifts the focus from local observation, categories and explanations and interpretations to those of the anthropologist. The edict approach realizes that members of a culture often are too involved in what they are doing to interpret their cultures impartially. When using the edict approach, the ethnographer emphasizes what he or she considers important. So typically the anthropologist comes from an edict perspective. They'll come in and they'll realize that the local people don't have enough distance to really understand their culture that well, just like you might not have understood before reading this article what it looks like to other people to go to the dentist, what it looks like to other people to have the holy shrine box in your bathroom and opening that every day in order to perform these magic rituals in your mouth or on your face. So that's he's using an edict perspective. The author of this article is using an edict perspective to look at American culture. Now, I might ask you, and just give you a second to think about this, which one of these perspectives is more valuable? Is the emic or edict perspective better? Well, the answer is both. They're both very important and they're both informative. Clearly, Horace Minor, when writing this article, is not encapsulating or capturing what me and you as Americans, if you're all Americans, I don't know, maybe some of you aren't Americans, what Americans think about their own culture. And that's important because you and I don't understand going to the dentist in the way that Horace Minor writes about. We don't understand going to the listener in the same way, or women baking their heads in ovens. But it's important to understand our perspective, that that's what we do and for what reasons. However, it's also important to have that distance and to look at things from the edict perspective as well. They are both important. So this gets us to this idea of, right down here, I'm looking, ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is going to be an important word that we're going to use a lot throughout this class. Ethnocentrism, having or based on the idea that your own group or culture is better or more important than others. And that's pretty much the opposite of cultural relativism. The idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practices should be understood based on that person's own culture. So anthropologists, we try not to be ethnocentric. We try not to judge other cultures by the standards of our culture. Otherwise, we would all be like Horace Minor, and we would be writing these books and these articles about how horrific every other culture is and how our own culture is amazing and perfect and the best. We try to be not ethnocentric. We try to be culturally relativistic. We try to use cultural relativism. We try to understand other cultures the way that those cultures understand themselves.